On June 3, 2015, a tense courtroom in Cape Town holds its breath. George Geweld Thomas stands there, eyes cold, as the judge delivers the final verdict for every murder the underworld king orchestrated. His empire of fear crumbles in seconds. But how did it come to this? South Africa's toughest gang boss didn't see it coming, nor did his accomplice and subordinates. His story is a dark ride, and it has only just begun. George Thomas came from Bishop Lavis, a rough area in Cape Town where gangs ruled. Poverty pushed him hard, and the 28th gang pulled him in. Geweld, meaning violence, fit him perfectly, a name whispered in terror. He climbed fast, turning streets into his kingdom. But every king falls, and his end was brewing. Murders, threats, power, he ran it all, even from a prison cell. The 28s followed all his orders, leaving bodies behind. Then the law struck back, hard and slow. A massive trial dragged him down. Secrets spilling out. Stick with us. His rise was wild, but his crash was epic. Thomas's childhood in Bishop Lavis was shaped by harsh realities. The Cape Town neighborhood was overrun with crime, unemployment, and gang violence. Children growing up there had few options, and many turned to the streets for survival. Schools were underfunded, jobs were scarce, and the police presence was more feared than trusted. In his world, power belonged to those who could take it by force. For boys like Thomas, the streets were both a playground and a battlefield. From an early age, he saw violence as a way of life. Gunshots were common, bodies turned up in alleyways, and families mourned sons lost to gang wars. The rules of survival were simple. Either you fought or you became a victim. Thomas chose to fight, and the older gangsters took notice. His path to the 28s was set long before he even understood what loyalty meant. The gang was more than a group. It was an empire, controlling drug trade, extortion, and murder both inside and outside of prison. Boys like Thomas were recruited young, molded into soldiers, and forced to prove themselves. He was no exception. When the time came to show his worth, he did it without hesitation. Initiation into the 28s was cruel. It was meant to break weak people and make strong people stronger. Violence as a way of life was what it was about, not just crying blood. Thomas always did what he was told, even if it meant stabbing a competitor or killing a traitor to death. He never said sorry, and he didn't hesitate or flinch. People who saw him knew he was different. Geweld was the name people would always call him because of how wild he was. In Afrikaans, it meant violence, which was a perfect word for him. He liked making people scared, not just doing what he was told. When his name was called out in public, people took a step back. He was young, but he was dangerous, and even the older members of the gang could see what he could become. Once his reputation was known, it was natural for him to rise. Power was taken by killing people in the 28s, not given. Thomas always followed the strict orders set by the gang because he knew about it. For every cruel thing he did, something better happened. He wasn't just another soldier, he was meant to lead. In the 28th gang, for every promotion, you had to get rid of a competitor, show your loyalty through violence, and never be weak. Thomas played the game so well that he moved up faster than anyone thought he would. He was ready to do anything, without any limits or planning. He got higher and higher, which was more dangerous. Bishop Lavis had seen a lot of murderers, but not many people were like him. He not only lived in the gang environment, he thrived there. What he did with the blood was not just business for him. He didn't have any limits, doubt, or guilt. Since his path was still being shaped, the violence wasn't over yet. Thomas's rise through the 28s was swift and brutal. He didn't wait for opportunities. He created them through fear, violence, and absolute loyalty to the gang's code. By the early 2000s, he had eliminated enough rivals to take control of the Bishop Lavis faction. His leadership wasn't questioned because those who challenged him never lived to tell the story. Every act of violence he committed sent a clear message. He was in charge, and no one was safe from his wrath. Under his rule, the 28s became more ruthless than ever. He expanded their grip on the Cape Flats, making sure that every illegal operation paid tribute to him. Murders were carried out in broad daylight to remind the public who controlled the streets. Extortion was rampant, with local businesses forced to pay for protection they never asked for. If anyone refused, they disappeared, their bodies dumped as warnings to others. Thomas wasn't just a leader, he was a mastermind. He didn't need to pull the trigger himself. He had soldiers who followed his orders without question. Arms trafficking became one of his most profitable ventures, supplying guns to criminals across Cape Town. Police crackdowns did little to stop him because officers were either too scared or already on his payroll. He didn't just control a gang, he controlled an entire criminal empire. Even behind bars, his power never faded. Prison wasn't a punishment for him, It was a new base of operations. From his cell, he orchestrated murders, drug deals, and street wars with the same precision as if he were outside. Smuggled phones kept him connected, and corrupt guards ensured his comfort. The walls of the prison might have held his body, but they never contained his influence. His biggest threat came from rival gangs, especially the clever kids. They wanted to take Bishop Lavis from him, and blood was the only way to settle it. Shootouts became a common sight, with bodies piling up on both sides. Thomas never backed down, sending his men to eliminate any challenge. The war didn't weaken him. It only proved how untouchable he had become. His name spread fear across Cape Town, from the poorest slums to the wealthiest suburbs. Mothers warned their children never to say his name out loud. Business owners knew that refusing his demands meant signing their own death warrants. The police struggled to keep up, always one step behind his movements. He wasn't just another gangster. He was the most feared man in South Africa's underworld. Every hit he ordered strengthened his grip on power. When someone crossed him, they vanished without a trace. He built a network of killers who moved like ghosts, striking before their targets even knew they were hunted. He controlled the drug trade, the streets, and even parts of the prison system. The authorities knew who he was, but no one could touch him. Thomas understood that fear was the greatest weapon of all. He ruled not just through violence, but through the certainty that defying him meant death. His men followed orders without question because they knew what happened to traitors. The 28s thrived under his leadership, growing more powerful with every crime committed. He had become a legend, a man whose name alone could make the toughest criminals think twice. But in the world of gangsters, no throne is ever secure. Betrayal was always around the corner, waiting for the right moment to strike. Thomas had built an empire on blood, but he knew that sooner or later the streets would demand his own. His reign wasn't over yet, but the forces working against him were growing stronger. The question wasn't if he would fall, it was when. Thomas had turned the 28s into an unstoppable force. Their influence spread beyond Bishop Lavis, controlling illegal and extortion rackets across Cape Town. Every major crime in the area had his fingerprints on it. Were common, bodies piling up as a warning to those who dared to defy him. Between 1999 and 2010, he didn't just lead a gang, he commanded an empire built on blood and fear. His rule was absolute, maintained through violence and intimidation. Businesses had no choice but to pay protection money, knowing refusal meant gang soldiers patrolled the streets, ensuring his orders were followed without question. Those who spoke against him were silenced, often executed in front of their families. He didn't need to be present to instill fear. His name alone was enough to terrify an entire community. One of the most shocking crimes under his rule was the attempted assassination of Curtis Esterhuizen in 2008. Thomas had ordered the hit, but his men the wrong man, Curtis's brother Marvin. The sent shockwaves through Bishop Lavis, proving that Thomas's reach extended far beyond his prison walls. A mistaken identity meant nothing to him. Once a name was marked for the had to be made. Even incarceration did not weaken his grip. If anything, it made him more powerful. He ruled from his cell with the same ruthlessness as he had on the streets. Smuggled cell phones kept him connected, allowing him to run his empire as if he were free. Between 2008 and 2010, multiple state witnesses were executed before they could testify against him. He didn't just kill his enemies, he erased any trace of resistance. Bishop Lavis became a war zone, its people trapped under his rule. Parents feared for their children, knowing that gang violence could strike at any moment. Store owners handed over their earnings just to stay alive. The police, either corrupt or too scared to act, turned a blind eye. No one was safe, and no one dared to speak his name above a whisper. But his reign of terror was starting to crack. The rising body count forced law enforcement to act. Operation Combat was launched, a task force dedicated to dismantling Cape Town's deadliest gangs. Officers gathered intelligence, mapped out the 28's network, and tracked Thomas's every move. For the first time, his empire was under siege. Thomas dismissed the threat. He had bribed officers, threatened witnesses, and watched cases against him crumble. He believed he was untouchable, laughing at the idea that anyone could stop him. But Operation Combat was different. It wasn't just another failed attempt at justice. The state had declared war on him, and this time, they wouldn't back down. His enemies saw an opportunity. Rival gangs wanted him out of the way. Some of his closest men began to crack under pressure, fearing they'd be next. Informants emerged from the shadows, feeding the police the details they needed. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, Thomas was losing control. He had built an empire on fear, but power in the underworld never lasts forever. His downfall wasn't just coming, it was inevitable. The question was no longer if he would fall, but when. Thomas had spent years believing he was untouchable. He had bribed officials, silenced witnesses, and ruled the streets from behind bars. No one dared to challenge him, and those who did ended up. But in 2008, his luck finally ran out. After a brutal incident linked directly to him, police had enough evidence to take him down. He was arrested and charged with 144 crimes, including 19 under the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. This was not just another gang case, it was South Africa's biggest trial against organized crime. Prosecutors had spent years building a rock-solid case, linking Thomas to an empire of violence, extortion, and the trial, held at the Western Cape High Court, lasted 5 years, stretching from 2010 to 2015. 19 co-accused stood beside him, facing a total of 166 charges. The sheer scale of the case made it one of the most complex legal battles in the country's history. Every gang-related crime in Cape Town seemed to trace back to Thomas, and this trial was meant to prove it. But putting Thomas on trial came at a deadly cost. The case was marked by bloodshed, with 12 linked to it before a verdict was even reached. 6 of those were state witnesses, found before that they could testify. Prosecutors faced constant threats, forcing them to live under protection. Guards surrounded the courtroom daily, and security was so tight that even court attendees had to pass fingerprint scans before entering. Authorities feared an attack at any moment, knowing that the 28s would do anything to protect their leader. The message from the gang was clear: this trial was a war, and they were willing to win. Despite the overwhelming threats, the prosecution pressed on. The evidence against Thomas was staggering. Investigators had traced over 33,000 phone calls back to him, proving he was still running the 28s from behind bars. It didn't matter how secure the prison was, Thomas had turned his cell into a command center. Witnesses described how he ordered hits, arranged deals, and managed extortion rackets from prison. His power stretched far beyond the prison walls, and no one dared to challenge his authority. The trial went on for 5 years and showed how big Thomas's criminal network was. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom and thought about the horrible things he had done to their loved ones. The prosecution's phone records, witness statements, and financial records all pointed to Thomas as the person who did it. His defense team tried to say that he wasn't directly involved, but the evidence made that impossible. He was there for every call, order, and as the walls came down, Thomas had nowhere to run for the first time in his life. It was finally at its peak in May 2015. Judge Chantal Fortuyn wrote an 800-page decision about how cruel Thomas's crimes were. Among the 53 charges against him were 7 racketeering and encouraging violence. He was found guilty of all of them. As the judge named his crimes one by one, everyone in the courtroom stopped moving. Every charge was another hammer blow to his kingdom, which used to be untouchable. The people of Cape Town had been waiting for this day, the day that George Geweld was caught. Thomas didn't move as the result was announced, and his face showed that he didn't understand. It had been decades since he had been caught, but this time there was nowhere to hide. He was no longer in charge of anything, and his empire had fallen apart. His only future was in prison. Cape Town had been in fear for more than 10 years, but it was finally over. People who had lived in fear of his rule still had one question: would his influence continue from jail, or is this really the end? The most feared gangster in South Africa was given the sentence on June 3, 2015. The courtroom was full of people who wanted to document history, the families of the victims, police officers, and reporters. George Geweld Thomas stood in front of the judge with a face that couldn't be read. He had spent years ordering with a single phone call, believing he was beyond the reach of the law. But today, the law had caught up with him. The verdict was final: 7 life sentences, 1 for each. And just to ensure there was no way out, an additional 175 years were added to it for attempted racketeering and other violent crimes. There would be no parole, no second chance. This was a sentence, just not in the way he had imagined. His empire had crumbled, and his most loyal men fell with him. 6 of his top enforcers, men who had carried out his orders without hesitation, also received life sentences. Their reputations, once built on terror, were now meaningless. They were no longer feared warlords of the Cape Flats. They were prisoners, stripped of power. The others in the courtroom, his remaining foot soldiers, received sentences ranging from 12 to 25 years. Some wept, others sat in stunned silence. They had ruled the streets for over a decade, but now the streets had rejected them. For Thomas, this was more than just a prison sentence. This was the destruction of everything he had built. His name had once commanded loyalty and obedience. Now, it was nothing more than a cautionary tale. Inside a maximum security prison, he had no soldiers, no weapons, and no control. He had spent years turning fear into power, but now fear had turned on him. He was locked away, just another inmate among criminals who had once worshipped him. And in a world where reputation meant survival, the knowledge that he had lost everything was perhaps a worse punishment than itself. Law enforcement officials did not hide their satisfaction. Brigadier Andre Lincoln, the man who had dedicated years to dismantling the 28s, stood outside the courthouse and declared, "We're crushing the number." The words were a warning to every gang still operating in the Cape Flats. Thomas had been their strongest leader, and now he was gone. The police had proven they could take down even the most untouchable gangsters. For the first time in years, there was a sense of victory. But in Bishop Lavis, the response was more complicated. On the surface, people were relieved. Parents no longer had to keep their children indoors at night, afraid of the next. Business owners, once forced to pay for protection, could finally breathe without fearing a stray. But beneath that relief was something else. Doubt. Geweld was gone, but the 28s were still there. His men were still out there, and the fear he had created didn't vanish overnight. Many wondered, was this really the end, or just a pause before the next reign of terror? Even behind bars, Thomas's name held power. Some whispered that he still had influence, that his orders could still reach the outside world. Others believed a new leader would rise, just as ruthless, just as violent. But for the first time in decades, the people of Cape Town had hope. Hope that the justice system has won. Hope that the gang war had lost its strongest commander. Hope that Geweld is finally truly over. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next one.